I'm very
Hi,
excited. Okay, no problem. I'm very excited about our presentation today, and I have the absolute honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marilyn Albert, who is a professor of neurology at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and she's also the director of the Division of Cognitive Neuroscience and the director of the Johns Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Over the course of her stellar career, she's conducted several large longitudinal studies that have aimed at improving our understanding of Alzheimer's disease, the most recent of which is focused on the earliest phases of Alzheimer's disease. This work uses biomarkers based on imaging, cerebrospinal fluid, blood, and genetics to better understand the earliest phases of Alzheimer's disease. In addition, she has a long-standing interest in the study of lifestyle factors that influence the risk of cognitive decline as people get older. Dr. Albert has been highly productive over her career. She's received a number of awards for her contributions to Alzheimer's disease research. She most recently received the Henry Wazinski Lifetime Achievement Award that's given by the Alzheimer's Association in 2019, and then the Raymond D. Adams Lectureship Award given by the American Neurological Association in 2023. I don't think there's anybody better to give us this presentation today than Dr. Marilyn Albert. Marilyn?
thank you so much, Roland, for that lovely introduction. So I think everybody knows I'm going to be talking about preparing an NIH Biosketch, but I'm also going to be talking about other related documents as well at the end of the talk. I'm going to first go over the sections and purpose of each part of a Biosketch. Excuse me. Talk about guidelines and give you some examples from an actual Biosketch. And then I'm going to be talking about all these other documents that I think are also very important, and including a timeline for grant preparation. And there should be time for questions and answers at the end of the talk. So I have here on this first slide what the sections of a Biosketch are, and you probably all know this. So it begins with a personal statement, and that's supposed to briefly summarize your current status and a broad overview of your research interests. Then there's a section on ongoing or completed grants. There's an optional section for publications that you might have relevant to the proposal. Then there's a required section on positions, scientific appointments, and honors. And then the bulk of the rest of the Biosketch is this section called Contributions to Science, where you're supposed to briefly summarize the research that you've done. And I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm going to talk about what I think are important things to include, and also, as I said, give you some examples. So first of all, just some general issues of importance that I want to highlight at the beginning for each of these sections that we were just talking about. With regard to the personal statement, this is really not supposed to be a pitch for the grant that you're writing. It's supposed to be a broad overview of your background and give some idea of the expertise that you have that's particularly related to the grant that you're submitting. And I'll give you an example, as I said, and we'll talk about that. The next section that's about ongoing and completed grants to highlight, you have no flexibility here. You have to put these grants in exactly the right order as I show you, because otherwise the Office of Research Affairs will hold up the application and make you change it. The section on positions, scientific appointments, and honors. Again, I'm going to go over that, but I just want to emphasize in the beginning that that you should be selective. I mean, even if you're young and you want to include an awful lot of things to make it look impressive, I don't think it's a good idea to include travel awards. I don't think it's a good idea to include high school accomplishments. I say that because actually I've seen Biosketches that have that sort of thing in it, so that's why I'm saying it. And then you'll see that when I go on, I'm going to talk a good deal about linking publications to NCBI. I'm going to show you how to do this. talk about why it's so important. And I also want to emphasize that this is the only part of an application that allows you to link to a URL outside of the application. One of the big problems that routinely happen to me quite regularly, is that somebody will include a URL or a link to something outside the application, and it's absolutely not allowed. The NIH considers this an effort to get around page limits. The last time I submitted an application, which was in the fall, several of the investigators that sent me their biosketches had all these hidden links that I actually couldn't even see. And it delayed our application quite a big deal, quite a long time, and was quite aggravating. So that's why I want to emphasize this now. So first, the personal statement. The reason that this is so important to think about is for any investigator, but particularly for a new investigator, this is likely the first thing that a reviewer is going to see after they read the abstract. They're going to open the grant, they're going to look at an abstract, then they're going to look at who the people are involved in the grant, and they're going to look at this personal statement. And they want to get a good sense, but briefly, of who you are and what your interests are. And I always recommend that the very first sentence should say what your current position is. Even though it's, elsewhere you can figure it out in the application, I just find that's kind of grounding. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, I'm an assistant professor, whatever, that you say in the beginning, what your appointment is. Then you're supposed to describe your background in very general terms. It's really helpful if it's in chronological order. And you want to particularly be sure that you highlight the experience that you have that's relevant to the grant somewhere in that personal statement. It doesn't have to be in the very beginning, but it has to be included in it. And then one very important thing is that the last sentence should say something about your role in the current grant. So if you're the PI, obviously, then you say why you think you're qualified to be the PI. If you're participating with other people, then you say something about why what your role is in the grant. But one of the things that happens to me routinely is that people will send me a biosketch. They might even have a statement at the end of the personal statement that's about a completely different grant, or they don't say what their role is in the grant. And so then I have to ask their permission to change it, because that's actually something that reviewers want to see. So this is an example of a personal statement from a K award that was recently funded, and I'm going to read through it just to give you an idea of something that I think is a good example of a personal statement. It says, I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So that's, as I was saying, first sentence is saying who this person is, what their position is. My research interests revolve around modifiable lifestyle factors that may delay the onset of age-related cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. I'm particularly interested in studying the associations between physical activity and cognitive function in older adults. My initial research examined the effects of physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness on brain structure and function using magnetic resonance imaging. More recently, these interests have expanded to include studies of energy needed for routine daily physical activities such as walking, the energetic cost of walking, and AD biomarkers through positron emission tomography. Now, just to explain, this investigator in his application that this was part of, in his K application, was going to be using MRI and PET scans and these measures of physical activity. So that's why specifically these were mentioned in the personal statement. Then he says the proposed research expands on this work to examine cognition and AD biomarkers in relation to both the upper and lower range of energy expenditure, cardiorespiratory fitness, and the energetic cost of walking, respectively. I will also gain additional training essential to conduct this research with the goal of becoming an independent investigator, conducting research in modifiable lifestyle factors, particularly as they relate to physical activity and cognition in older adults. So you see here what he's doing is he's saying, this is my background. This is how it ties with a proposed application. And in this particular instance, because it's a training grant, he's also mentioning the training that he's proposing to do. So this just very briefly, concisely summarizes who he is, what he's interested in, and that makes it very, very helpful to the reviewer of an application. The next, let me maybe just see if there's a question about this before I go on, because this is a very important part of the Biosketch.
Marilyn, this is George. I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I've seen biosketches, including some that I've submitted, where you start out with briefly summarizing and describing the project that is being submitted, and then why you are qualified to either, be principal investigator of that project or co-I or whatever. It's not a pitch for the grant necessarily, but it's just sort of a summary of the overarching objectives. And then here's why I'm qualified to be part of this research. And this seems sort of the reverse of that you start out with who you are and then work through your experience and then up to what this research involves and then why you're qualified. You have any thoughts on?
No, I mean, I have seen biosketches like that, and all I can tell you is that I much prefer this version, and it's because, sometimes the statement will say, let's say I'm a professor of biostatistics and I'm well qualified to participate in this research on X, but it doesn't really give you the context. You know what I mean?
I see.
If you
Yeah.
read, I'm a professor of biostatistics. This is the research that I've done. These are my interests. This is why I'm participating in this particular, it seems to flow much better to me.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So that's why this has always been my preference.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so then the next section is the part that I said we don't have really any flexibility about. It's where you list your active and or completed grants. It's now much, much easier than it used to be, which is really great. And the format of the grant that is required is what you can see here. You have the grant number, the name of the PI. If you're not the PI, then your role, then the beginning and end dates of the grant, and then the title of the grant. And it has to be in that order. All of those elements have to be there. And what I discovered, I mean, Roland was mentioning the things you keep learning. What I discovered pretty recently was that if you have grants that are more than 3 years old, ORA might make you remove them, so which I had never known before. But anyway, this is where you list the grants. Even though I'm involved in many grants, I typically only list maybe 3 or 4, not a lot. And if you're a junior investigator, you might not have that many, but you list the ones that you have participated in some way or another. And this is something that the Office of Research Affairs will look at very carefully because it is a required format and they'll send it back if it's incorrect. Then there's an optional section where you can list publications that are relevant to the proposal. I always encourage people to do that if they do have publications that are relevant. You can't list more than 4. And I particularly think it's helpful to do it in reverse chronological order so people can see the most recent one you have as opposed to the older one. This is an example from this particular application that I'm using in today's talk as an example. It's helpful if you're a first author or a last author to list them here because this is the first place that somebody's going to see something about your productivity. And as you'll see, these articles all have PMC ID numbers, which I'm going to come to later on. And I would say, of course, you know, when you're starting out, you maybe don't have lots of publications, but if you can, it's good within the Biosketch not to duplicate any of them, because it gives people some idea of how much productivity you have. So even if maybe some of them are a little bit more minor, maybe you highlight the major ones here and then others later on, but if possible, as I said, not to duplicate them. So then there's another section called Physician Scientific Appointments and Honors. This is now a requirement to have the elements in reverse chronological order. It didn't used to be that way. And again, I get biosketches sent back to me by ORA if we've missed something. They look at this very carefully. So you just have the positions that you have. You list them in reverse chronological order, each in these sections, physicians and scientific appointments, and then honors. And this is the place where I said earlier, I think it's not a good idea to include things like travel awards or accomplishments in high school or whatever. This is to say that you're, you know, a professional researcher, what your background is, as much as possible, give people an idea of what appointments and positions you've had in your career. So now we come to the bulk of the Biosketch, which is the scientific contributions. And here you have a lot of leeway, and so you have to think a lot about the themes that you're going to emphasize that demonstrate your experience. You want at least one of them to be directly pertinent to the application. I think that it's helpful to have not more than 3 of them, certainly not more than 4. I mean, at a certain point, you'll run out of space because a page requirement is 5 pages. You're allowed to have 4 citations per section. If you have more than that, ORA will send it back. And again, you want to have as much as possible articles on which you're either the first or the last author, but of course, you know, that might not always be possible, and it may not always be desirable. You might want to emphasize articles that are particularly relevant to the grant, and you're a middle author. This is where the issue of PMCID numbers comes in. I also mentioned it earlier. The NIH really wants you to include PMCID numbers, and sometimes there's confusion about that. Every article that gets published gets what's called a PMID number. That just is a number that says this is an article, it's been published. The PMCID number is something that means that it's freely available to the general public. In other words, that means if you go online, you click on it, if something has a PMCID number, it will open and you can read it. The reason that this is so important to the NIH is that a number of years ago, in a little before 2008, the Congress said, you know, we're giving you all this money and we can't tell what the productivity is. And we want to be able to see whatever it is that we're paying for and the research that you've been producing. And that's where this PMCID number came from. It's a mechanism for making the article freely available to the public. And I don't know of any grant that's been rejected because it doesn't have enough PMCID numbers, but I take that threat very seriously. And when I get a biosketch from somebody, and I think that it might have PMCID numbers that are missing, I try to find them because I try to have as many PMCID numbers in a biosketch as I possibly can. And I'm going to go into the details about how you can link them to your biosketch. But now more and more, most journals are generating these automatically, but not all of them do. And so that's something that's your responsibility for keeping track of. So this is an example. I'm going to show you a couple of sections in this particular application to show you what was written for contributions of science, and then I'll stop and see if you have any questions. So this grant obviously was on physical fitness and biomarkers. So the very first section that this applicant has is titled Cardiorespiratory Fitness and Cognition. And then he talks about the work that's gone on in fitness and cognition, and then the work that he's done. And that's what occupies this section, which I'm not going to read in detail. The next section then is about physical activity and brain structure and function. So this earlier one was about cognition. This is about biomarkers. So it's breaking it down into, these are all having to do with physical activity because he's a young investigator. This is just what he's been working on. But he's making it into sections that people can follow and, you know, sort of chunks that are meaningful. And here again, he's talking about the work that he's done on the relation on using biomarkers like MRI and PET scans in relation to physical activity. And this is a young investigator, so we were trying to think of some other third area that he might have, and it happened that he had some work in health disparities and modifiable lifestyle factors. And so that was the third section that he has. And I don't have the whole full text here, but just to give you an idea that we actually gave some thought to how it would be broken down, and we figured out what chunks could be used. And then within each of these sections, he has a list of publications. So let me stop there because I'm going to go on and talk about PMCID numbers and things like that, see if people have any questions about this contributions to science or the earlier sections about positions, scientific appointments, honors. Any questions?
I have a question, ma'am. My question is that if I apply for a grant, which is a new area for me, as I am an early career researcher, and say most of my publications or contribution to science are directly not related, so what do you suggest how to put my publications like which are not related, but I have my publications. So say if I apply for a grant or Alzheimer's or for older adults, but mostly my background previously was sexual reproductive health of women. So but few on aging and aging research I have. So can I add those? And my second query is like I have seen some biosketches where not only my direct publications are cited, but say I worked for a project on aging, but from that project, if the others publications are there, can I cite those where my name is not there?
So you don't want to cite something where your name is not there, but it's perfectly fine to say in your personal statement, you know, my original research area was X. Now I become more and more interested in aging, you know, and then from that, whatever the finer topic is, and then you want to mirror that in the section on contributions to science. So you would have the first thing, as you were saying, you know, an area that was really not related to what you're doing. But then if aging is kind of the linking area, then you would have that. And if you have anything at all in the area that you're applying in, then you would want to have that as a third section. I mean, you really, you really need, I think, if you're applying in an area that you haven't done a lot of work on, you need at least one publication in order to show, you know, some validity for your interest. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Because thank you for clarifying that I cannot put any other contribution to science, because in my previous biosketch I put, like, I used to work for longitudinal aging study of India, and I don't have direct any articles, but many good articles were published from that project where I used to work. So I cited them, but now I think I will remove them and will try to cite my own research.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yes,
Thank
yes.
you. Thank you.
Any other questions before we go on? Okay, so now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about linking publications to your bibliography. And the reason I'm going to spend time on this is that, as I said, these articles really need to have, as much as possible, PMC ID numbers, but you also want them linked to your bibliography, because in a biosketch at the very, very end, you have an optional section where you can say, see list of published work in my bibliography, and then you have a link. This is the link to your bibliography in NCBI. As I said earlier, it's the only real link that you're allowed to some other source in your entire application. And it's particularly important if you're a young investigator, because you're only allowed, well, if you had 4 publications and 3 areas for contributions to science, that would make 12 publications. If you took advantage of that earlier section, then it would be a total of 16, because you can only have 4 per section. So if you have more than 16 publications, the only way a reviewer can see that is by this link. So that might actually be important if somebody's not quite sure how productive you've been. They're interested in seeing what you've done in other areas. For instance, as this investigator was just asking me, she had a lot of work in another area. She's only allowed to list 4 of them here, but you might want to see the other ones that she had published in this area. So this is where you can put them in your bibliography. And as I said, it's technically not required, but I think it's really, it's particularly important. And sometimes you see in a summary statement, somebody will say, oh, they looked at your bibliography and they could see how productive you were. So I think it's really something to take very seriously. So the system for, I'm not going to obviously spend time going into all the details, but if you link onto NCBI, there are 2 places where you can link to your bibliography. You can either go to this section that says My Bibliography under Collections, or you can go to Manage My Bibliography under Bibliography. And then you just click on this link that will bring you to a place where you can add publications. And then in order to add the publication, you put in, if there is a PMC ID number, what the number is. If there isn't, then you put in the name of the article. You click where it says add to my bibliography, and then it adds that to your bibliography electronically. And it just will do that automatically every article that you add. At the end, then all of these things are there. You'll be able to see them, that they're in your bibliography. And then if you can, for the ones that are relevant, you might want to link them to the grant that they were involved with. That's less important for you writing, a grant application, but it's very important for the people whose work supported the research. So if you were involved in a grant, then a list of publications will come up. This is just an example of some of the ones that come up. If you put in my name, and then you would click the grant that you want to link the article with, and you would click apply, and then that particular article would be linked to that grant number. Then the key here is, once you get all of that into your bibliography, you want to generate this URL that you can put at the bottom of your NIH Biosketch. So you find a place here, as I'm showing you, where you say, make bibliography public. And once you do that, then it generates the link, which you see here. And then all you have to do is copy it and put it at the bottom of your Biosketch. And you can test to be sure if it's really working, obviously, by just clicking on it. So I've spent this time talking because it's really important, right? To have these PMC ID numbers, link them to your NIH Biosketch, make them available for review by the people who are reading your application. So now, as I've sort of been going along, I've been mentioning other people's Biosketches besides yours. And in a grant that you're responsible for, you really are responsible for the Biosketches of your collaborators and your mentors if it happens to be a training grant. So you have to request those well in advance so that you can go through them. As we were talking, you want to be sure that the personal statement is somehow relevant to the grant. Many times people send me their Biosketches, and you can tell that this has been written for some entirely different grant. So you have to revise it, and you have to be sure, as I was saying earlier, that there's something in there that says, you know, I'm participating in this grant as a contributing my expertise as a co-investigator or whatever it is that's relevant to the grant. And you want to see, if possible, if there's at least one section that is related to that person's expertise that's relevant to the grant. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I do look to see if there are enough PMC ID numbers, and I try to find them if I think they're missing. I will actually have either myself or someone on my staff hunt them up and add them to the Biosketch, because I don't want the NIH to reject my grant application. Okay, so now I'm going to turn from Biosketches to other sections. So let me just ask before I go on if there are any other questions about what I've been saying about Biosketches. Okay, so the other sections of the grant, this is obviously not talking about the science, just the administrative sections of the grant, are actually very important. And I think of them as being obviously not equally important to the science, but things that I give a lot of careful attention to. The first, obviously, is the budget. You want to be sure that you're asking for enough money to do the work, because, and obviously you have to be sure that you have enough time to do the work. And you have to think about being sure that you have the support in the budget for the work that needs to be done. In the budget justification, you need to actually justify the costs. And sometimes I just got a budget justification from someone the other day. It had a whole list of chemicals that were going to be purchased without any explanation of why they were important for the, you know, in relation to the grant. You know, no context in which any of it was placed. So the purpose of the justification is really that we need these things because. So you list them out and you explain why. The facilities and resources section is also not only important, but it really allows you to provide a lot more information above and beyond what's in the scientific section of the grant, right? It's talking about the resources that you have, the facilities that you have, because the work can't get done without them. I was very surprised recently. I was talking to a young investigator about how important the facilities and resources section was. And she said to me, well, I've published in this area, so I must have the equipment and the supplies. So why would I need to list all of that there? But the reviewers are looking to see, can you specify what facilities, what resources you have that are necessary for the grant, and tell them about it. They're going to look at it really carefully. Additionally, at least at the Office of Research Affairs here, most people require a section called Scientific Environment at the very beginning. And I think I have an example of that I can read you. And then the same thing with equipment, that if you need equipment that's relevant for the grant, you have to list it, even if it's, yes, of course, we have MRI scanners or PET scanners or digital, but you want to not only list it because it supports what you're doing, but it gives you an opportunity to provide much more additional detail above and beyond the detail in the research section itself. This is an example of a scientific environment section from this particular grant that I've been showing you. And I'm going to read it just to give you an idea. I mean, it's a required section, so you might as well try to make it sensible. The training and research program described in this application will be housed in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, established in 1893. The School of Medicine is consistently ranked as one of the top medical schools in the U.S. It maintains a longstanding tradition of excellence, blah, blah, blah. The proposed training and research project includes investigators and resources from the School of Medicine, the School of Public Health, and in this instance, the NIA. One of the key features of Johns Hopkins University is its emphasis on collaboration, which fosters interdisciplinary research as exemplified by the proposed training and research program. So it's not very long. It gives people, I mean, if you're reading this, you know right away that this application involves investigators from all these different institutions. And then it's giving this little tweak at the end about how much value people put on collaboration and interdisciplinary research, which was particularly relevant for this grant. And I would mention, as I said, that ORA tends to require this, even though I'm not entirely sure that it's required by the NIH. And they have sent things back to me if this scientific environment statement wasn't there. The other things that are really important to pay attention to in a grant are the letters of support. Now there's this section on authentication of key biologicals. If you have human subjects, then that's a very long section you can include. And then there are these additional sections that some grants have, which are a grant timeline, a recruitment plan, and a retention plan. So in terms of the letters of support, it's really important for you as the applicant to draft the letters of support. The reason that's important is that they have to say specifically what this person is going to do within the grant, and it has to be said in a way that's exactly relevant to what you want them to do. And in some cases, there are page limits on these letters of support. That's particularly true in training grants. So it's really your obligation to draft them and to send them to whoever is going to be sending them back to you. The section on key biologicals is a relatively new section. And it allows you to add important information and details that you might not have room for elsewhere. It's mostly about the biological or molecular sources that you're using in the application. But the beginning, and I'll show you an example, calls for a general section where you can talk about the rigor of the methods that you're using. The protection of human subjects section in a grant that involves human subjects has no page limits. So that means you have an awful lot of room to provide a great deal of detail about how, the methods that you're using. For instance, if you're doing imaging, if you're doing cognitive testing, if you're recording things from devices of any kind, all the details can go in there So long as you have the standard headings that are required in this section, you can put an awful lot of information in there. And then in the body of the grant, you can just say, see additional details in the protection of human subjects. I would just say that just yesterday, I was talking to a young investigator who has a grant that is going to be funded, but an NIA asked her to fix her section on human subjects. She's a biostatistician. She's a very talented one. And she had a sentence that essentially said, this has nothing to do with human subjects because it's just data. And they were not happy with that. They wanted her to say that this was, you know, data involving human subjects, that the data had all personal identifiers had been removed, that nobody analyzing the data would have access to it. It was just the funniest thing. So people are going to, it actually said in her summary statement, what her statement was unacceptable, right? Because she hadn't thought about it very carefully. And then, as I said, there are these additional sections: grant timeline, recruitment plan, and retention plan. And I'll show you an example of a grant timeline, which is here. So this is the grant timeline from this training grant that we've been talking about. And this was in the body of the grant. And something like that is required in a training grant, but also increasingly now it's required in most grants that you would write. So you have on the left-hand side what the things are that are going to be done, and then you have across the top over the years when the work is going to be done. And within the context of a training grant, this might be very, very important because you might have certain kinds of training in some years and not others, work with some mentors in some years and not others. But in the body of a regular grant, it might also be important because maybe you're only going to do assays in year 4 and none in year 1, 2, and 3. So you can outline that within the context of this kind of timeline. And this is just an example, as I was saying before, about authentication of biologicals with this section in the front saying general. And the purpose of this is really to talk about the rigor with which the data are collected. All experiments are recorded in a physical lab notebook. Experimental data are referenced to files stored in a central lab computer. For each figure, panel, publication, we require primary data to be archived. It's all about the rigor and reproducibility of the data. And you can say something there which allows you to communicate to the reviewer how careful that you're being. I would just mention again, relevant to the comment that Roland made in the beginning, that the last grant I submitted, one of my investigators had some references here, and the Office for Research Affairs made me take them out, which wastes a lot of time. So even a section like this, they look at really carefully. The other thing that I try to emphasize when I talk about preparing a grant is tracking very carefully what has to be done and whether or not it's being accomplished. I know that this is not very readable, but this is what I do for myself. So I have a document, is usually a Word document. I have on the side each of the sections that I need. I have an estimated date for when I think I need them. In some cases, I have clues to myself as to how long they have to be. You know, this is 4 pages. This can be 3 lines, 30 lines. And then I list the dates when I want them. And then as I get these documents or as they're completed, I fill out, I actually put in check marks in these columns when things are ready. And I find this actually essential when I prepare a grant. I mean, my grants tend to be very complex, but even if they weren't, it's a way of reminding yourself what you need to do, being sure that it's on time and on target. If you've asked people for things and you haven't gotten them back yet, you keep looking at this and reminding yourself and going back to people to get documents. I actually find that sometimes as I'm going through a grant, I'll reorder these because I realize that I need some things sooner than I had anticipated. And I want to remember that for future occasions. So I take this very seriously, keeping track of each section, being sure that it's completed, reminding myself, at the end, there are so many details that you have to keep track of. So it's really helpful to be reminded of the scope of the timeline. So I just wanted to end by talking about time in general. I think anybody who's written a grant will tell you that you never end up having enough time. However long you think it's going to take, it always takes longer. So you need to try to think as far in advance as you can. If you need preliminary data, you might have to start collecting it a year in advance, right? I mean, it depends on the data that you're looking for. I often encourage people to start writing a grant 6 months in advance, certainly 4 or 5 months in advance. It just takes a long time to put the pieces together. And part of the reason that you want to do it so far in advance is that you want enough time to get feedback. There is not a single time that I write a grant that I don't send sections of it to other people to look at and make changes. In order to do that, you need time. You have all these documents that you need from other people, biosketches, letters of support, maybe things having to do with the budget. So you need time to get that back from people. And then there are all of these administrative sections, not only the budget, the resources and environment pieces that you might have to get from other people. And it just takes a really long time. So you need to plan as far in advance as you can and then keep track of it as you're going along. I would just say, sort of in conclusion, that it sounds like a lot. I know that it sounds maybe a little daunting, but it's a skill. It's a skill that you can learn. I learned it from other people, from working with other people and seeing how they did it. And then you learn sort of from your own mistakes over time. It's just something that eventually, over time you can learn. So the sooner you start learning it, the better if you're going to be in an academic setting. So let me stop there. I think there's a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has any, I'll be happy to answer them, and just sort of general discussion.
Marilyn, thank you so much for the presentation. But I have to tell you, Marilyn, I got kicked out and I'm just now getting back on. I've been fighting back and forth, but I'm sure it was great. I want to open up, see if anyone has any questions.
I didn't kick you off, Roland.
No, you didn't kick me off. The system kicked me off. Then I had to do Zoom updates and all that other stuff.
I saw you nodding your head at one point, Joe. You have any comments?
No, it's really good. I mean, it's you've added things from the last time.
Yes.
Can I just ask like a reaction? Is sort of the idea of where do you tell what people's roles are? Because sometimes I see in the Biosketch, so you mentioned about expertise, but then sometimes in the Biosketch, people write, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z. And then I've also seen in the budget justification, right? And lately, I don't know, I don't think it's required, but I've seen some grants where in the body of the grant, they actually have a paragraph where they say this is the team and all,
Yes,
which reminds me of the days
that's a really good question. Yeah.
when it was 25 pages, but it seems like, why would you want to use that space?
Yeah. Well, in a training grant, I always have people write what people's roles are. I always have them have a section. It's sort of like a mini table where they have the name of each advisor and mentor and say what they're going to do. So that's in a training grant.
Yeah.
But you're right that I duplicate it. So absolutely, it will be in the Biosketch at the end of the personal statement. But then in the budget justification, absolutely.
Right.
I use the budget justification to provide a lot of information.
Right.
So I always say, this is what they're going to do. This is why they're going to do it. This is who they're going to do it with sometimes, because there's room for that in the budget justification. They're going to work with so-and-so, whatever.
And you want to make sure it's copacetic with what's in a letter of support.
Yes, yes.
But what about, well, you don't have to spend time on it, but sometimes you've seen this in the grant, and I'm thinking, why would you use space in the grant for that?
Yeah.
Things reviewers are going to look at?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so we submitted a grant in the fall that was very complex, and it wouldn't be lengthy, but it might just be so-and-so will get these samples from so-and-so and then do these, you know what I'm saying? So people can follow the flow.
Right.
And that might be in the body of a grant, so that nobody's wondering how this is going to get from one person to the next.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Joe, can I add on something, Marilyn?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
No, we won't let you, Roland. You can't.
So I just wanted to say, Joe, I wrote a grant, and we added, it was just 1 to 2 sentences, because the crux of the grant is that you had to have an interdisciplinary team. And so we set it up right before we did the preliminary studies. We said but we also said for details, see Biosketch. And so we pointed them to that, but we said, Roland's going to do this, Joe's going to do that, and George is going to do that, and Marilyn's going to do that. But all the details and expertise is in the Biosketch. That's the reason why, because it called for it.
Right. But also sometimes we'll say something about the statisticians will do X, in a particular setting. I mean, where it seems really that it helps to clarify how people are going to work together, but not usually, as Roland was saying, in any formal way. But because you're right, you don't have a lot of space. And it's always the case that I'm counting letters at the end. Like, you're wondering, how did I take up all this space? And I have to take 2 words out of the sentence, so I won't be over the page limit. Any other questions?
Marilyn, there was a situation I ran into. You talked about the importance of the page limits with Biosketches, 5-page limit. And usually investigators are pretty good with checking for page limits. And so they'll submit, and I always look, but most of the time they're within 5 pages. But in this case, they sent me, and this happened, I think, on 2 separate occasions, a Word document that was 5 pages, but when converted to a PDF, it bled over to a 6-page. And then the grant bounced back to us, and it was fixable, but it just kind of took time, and it was sort of annoying.
Yeah.
And so, you want to check that, download it, convert it to a PDF, just make sure it still fits within that 5-page limit. Yeah.
And we've sometimes had the experience where we didn't realize, reviewing a document like a Biosketch, that there was an extra page at the end, a blank page.
Yeah.
And then that got uploaded.
And that got uploaded, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot of details that you have to keep track of. But I hope that everybody realizes that this really it's a skill. Like, I don't know, playing tennis, riding a bike, you learn the tricks, and then the next time it's easier and easier and easier. And you always have to try to have help, have people looking at it. I mean, we're not talking about the actual content today very much, but if somebody says something isn't clear, you change it, because that means it's not clear to somebody.
Oh, I know that also. We're writing our first draft with the RCMAR with George. He says, Roland, this isn't clear, this isn't clear. Then I decided, Marilyn, maybe I shouldn't be writing at 11 at night. So when I started writing during the day, it became clear.
Well, I always think everything's so great, and then I reread it the next day and realize, oh no, what was I thinking?
Well, if there are no more questions, Marilyn, I want to be mindful of the time too, as we're coming up to 2 o'clock. I want to say thank you for a great presentation. George, Joe, do y'all have anything else you want to add?
Just thank you, Marilyn. That was fabulous.
Yeah.
Just fabulous.
Well, it's lots of years of experience.
We do have one more question. We have one more
Not
question.
not question, but a request to maybe Veronica, that can we have the slides or this recording
Yes,
shared,
yes.
because this is very useful to me, so that I can have it like listen to it later on also.
Yeah, absolutely. Veronica, just remind me and I'll send you the slides.
Okay, sure.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Well,
Have a
have a good
good
day.
weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.